I am thrilled to be sitting here with my friend Esau McCaulley. Esau, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I've been on, this is my second time.
This is your second time, so I feel very honored whenever I have a repeat guest. Listeners to the podcast might remember, but also could just go back. You wrote a book a couple years ago that was a best-selling account of really a scholarly account of reading the Bible. It's called Reading While Black, right? Am I
Yeah.
getting the title right? Yeah.
Yes.
So, and there are hints in that book that you might head in this direction of where you ended up, which is more of a memoir called "How Far to the Promised Land," which
Oh, there are
when we're
hints. I
talking,
didn't know that.
is
There's
coming out.
hints.
Yeah, you have a tone in Reading While Black of just you're able to tell personal stories even in the midst of that's a more scholarly book, but there's still an accessibility to it and an ability to recognize that we don't come to faith and we don't come to the Bible just from this like kind of clinical academic objective perspective,
Yeah.
but also with our personal stories. So it didn't I don't know. It didn't feel terribly surprising to me that you would
Oh,
end up here, but maybe I'm alone in that. I don't know.
no, no, no. I mean, I'm glad. I didn't know if people would go, what's this New Testament scholar trying to do some kind of memoir, tradey kind of book? So I'm glad that there were some hints of different things that were in me. And so I'm glad that you saw it there.
Well, and I've also followed your work because you've written, I don't know, pretty regularly for the New York Times. And again, in that context, I feel like you are taking personal stories and using your training as a scholar to help me understand the church in America, being Black in America, these kind of bigger, almost sociological things that are happening. And I see a lot of that in this book as well. So I think you weave it all together and it all makes sense, at least from my vantage point.
Yeah, so there is kind of like I mean, when Reading My Black came out, it was obviously a little bit more on the academic, but it kind of balanced academic and more trade stuff. And since then, I've done some things that are a little bit more accessible. I wrote a children's book, Josie Johnson Hair and the Holy Spirit. I wrote a book about Lent. And obviously, I've done like basically a little over once or twice a month is what I write for the New York Times. So obviously, those pieces are much more in an accessible voice. And so this book is actually more in the New York Times voice than it is some of my more technical scholarship.
Yes, and I want to agree that you have made that your story a very accessible one, but it's also one where it's not surprising to find out that you have academic training just because it's so deeply thoughtful. And I will start though by asking you. There's a really early on you share an anecdote and you write, "I learned early on to tell the story America requires from its Black survivors." And then you go
Yeah.
on to essentially say, but I'm not going to tell you that story, right? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the story that America requires from its Black
Yeah.
survivors, but also the story that you want to tell instead.
Yeah, I call it, and my editor would not let me use this as a quip. They took it out, so I'm going to slide it in right now. I call it a Horatio Alger story
Okay.
dipped in chocolate. And so what that means is that we love to hear the story of people who grew up in poverty, who overcame tremendous odds to make it to the middle class, like the promised land. And there's something about telling that story that does a lot of things for the reader. So it allows you to kind of
Mm.
condemn the racism and the poverty because you're rooting for the protagonist. Like, oh, they should experience those things. And so you kind of go on the emotional journey with the protagonist, but you know they're going to live because they wrote the book, right? And so the danger that you
Yes.
feel isn't actually real. And when you get to the end, those books can not all of them, they can say, well, look, if you work really hard, you'll make it. And so, yes, America treats Black people poorly, but some of us make it. And if enough of us make it, then America can't be so bad. You kind of see this thing all of the time. Look at this successful Black person. How can America have problems? And what I wanted to say is, first of all, those stories can normalize the requirement for exceptionalism. Like real progress is just being able to survive as a
Mm.
normal person without climbing through all the things people to climb through. But the second thing is it has a wrong definition of success. And there are tons of people who were in my life who did not become successful as society defines success, but their lives matter too.
Mm-hmm.
And attending to their stories
Yeah.
teaches us something about America as well. And so it's not just that I want to question the exceptionalism narrative. That's part of it. But it's like, well, whose stories matter? And what tends to happen is people who the exceptional person passes along the way are simply object lessons that teaches the hero things they need to know for their journey. I want to say, no, no, no. It isn't just
Mm.
what this person taught me that matters. Their life in and of itself is beautiful and important, and it teaches us something about what it means to be human, even if they don't make it all the way to the promised land. And so it's really a way of saying, if you're going to tell a story, the hero isn't the only person who matters. It's the people who are
Mm.
around someone who makes them who we are. We're all shaped by a community. And so when it came time for me to write a memoir, the only thing that felt true to me was not to tell my story, but to tell the story of my community, my church, my family, my neighborhood, my city, the South, as a way of getting at the truth of things.
Yeah, and I really appreciated that you directly addressed that very immediately within the book, because
Yeah.
there is a tendency. I was just having a conversation with a faculty member at the school where my husband works, a Black faculty member, about kind of school teacher hero narratives, movies like Stand By Me, and there was one with Michelle Pfeiffer, and how tempting it is for both of us. He's like, I don't know, he's probably a 30-year-old Black man, and I'm a 46-year-old white woman. We both get hooked by those stories, and yet they perpetuate a narrative, both of like in the Michelle Pfeiffer case, like white saviorism, but in either case of just like exceptional heroes, as opposed to both what you're saying, like community support in terms of what matters, and also that sense of like, it's who we are that matters. And if we are going to hang our hopes on individuals overcoming against ridiculous odds that should never be ridiculous in the first place. I mean, you just do a really good
Yeah.
job of gently but firmly knocking down, I think, some of those expectations as a reader that I am just going to kind of celebrate with you as you leave behind all of the, because you also do a good job of every aspect every aspect of your story is complicated in what I would say is a good way, like in a way that's where you say we're not having heroes and villains here, whether that's like a dad who is kind of haunts you in some ways throughout the book, and also you are able to really reckon with what's going on with my dad, who was not the dad
Yeah.
I wanted him to be, and yet also how can I understand that and honor him as a human. There's so many. He's probably the most prominent character in that role, but
Yes.
there are plenty of them. um, and I thought I might ask you a question that maybe will get at that a little bit. One of the things that fascinated me throughout the book as I was reading was your name. So we learn as readers that your name is Esau Daniel McCaulley Jr.
Yeah.
Are you Junior?
Well, that's a question, isn't it?
Could you tell us the story of your Could you tell us the story of your name? Yeah. Tell
um,
us about your name.
it's really interesting because that is a story that I have been sitting on for I mean, I've known it my whole life, but I've not told people this story anywhere in print. And most of the time, if you meet me, I don't tell you this story. So people oftentimes ask me, "How
Hmm.
do you get the name Esau?" This is like a question that like I get. It's like if you know the Bible, the first question
Yeah.
you ask is like, "Why are you named Esau, not Jacob?" Or what happens when people meet me? They when they meet me again, they always change my name to a slightly more acceptable biblical character. So like, hey, Eli
Huh.
or Elijah, or they kind of go Enoch. It's got to be somebody better than Esau, right? And and I kind of go, nope, it's Esau. And I in the story, I mean, it's kind of hard
Will you
to,
just for any
yeah,
Will
for
you
people
just
who don't
tell
know.
for any listener who doesn't know, like if people don't know Esau from the Bible, will you just
Okay, yeah.
tell what that story is?
So there's two brothers in the Bible, Esau and Jacob. Jacob is the chosen brother who becomes the founder of the nation of Israel. Like from Jacob comes the 12 tribes. And so Jacob is the chosen one, and Esau is the unchosen one. And Jacob steals Esau's birthright. So Esau's the older of the two twins. He's supposed to inherit all of his father's stuff, but Jacob kind of steals it from him. And so Esau is kind of this misfit character who can never really get himself together throughout most of the biblical narrative. And he becomes the founder of this group of people called the Edomites, who are Israel's kind of arch enemies as the story goes along. And so in the story, then everyone
Yeah.
names their kid Jacob. There's tons of Jacobs all running around because Jacob is the chosen one. Esau's like the unchosen one. It'd be almost not equivalent to, but like
Right.
just name your kid Judas. It just doesn't happen very often, right? And so how did I
Right.
get my how did I get my name? No shade to the Judases out there, but I've never met another Esau in person, except for my father, who shares my name. To make a long
Hmm.
story short, I will tell the first part of the story. They got to read the book to get the whole of the narrative. But
All right.
my father's father was illiterate, but he was a pastor. He was a minister at the time, and so he opens the Bible and he points at a word to pick a name for his son. And according to the family lore, he opens the Bible and points at a name, and the name that he points to is Esau. So he
Hmm.
gives his son the name Esau. And then, so my father's name is Esau McCaulley. So my father wants his firstborn son to be named Esau as well. But my mom's also the child of a pastor, and she knows that Esau's kind of a misfit in the Bible. So she says, well, we need to give
Yeah.
him a better biblical name to balance it out. So she gives me Daniel as a middle name. And Daniel's this heroic character who is faithful to Israel under exile. So I become Esau Daniel McCaulley. And so my father for most of my life is Esau McCaulley, and I'm Esau Daniel McCaulley. And that changes later on in our life. But that idea of, for a long time, I used to have this fear because Esau, at this key moment in his life, makes a bad decision. He trades his birthright for a pot of stew. And I used to always think that one day
Yeah.
I'm going to make some huge mistake, like my
Hmm.
namesake, that kind of ruins my future. And along the story, at the end of the book, me and my father finally have a conversation about my name and the name that we share and its meaning. And it's a really important part of the book. And so I don't want to spoil it for people. It's kind of weird to say, like, you should read that part, but that's one of my favorite parts in the book. And as a matter of
No,
fact,
but I agree.
that's one of the last parts that I wrote. I sent that in as a part of the last edits. So that was the
Hmm.
like, I gotta have this in there. And I put it in at the last minute.
Well, I'm glad you incorporated it because it's a complicated thing for any of us, I think, to share names with our parents. And that's
Yeah.
a complicated thing for you, which you also write about in the book. Then it's complicated by this sense of nobody else is named Esau because no one would want to be because of the story in the Bible. And then I'll give a little bit of a teaser for listeners to go buy the book that the way you do resolve all of that doesn't let go of that complicated history, but it is really a redemptive reading of your own life and of your relationship with your dad and of Esau in the Bible.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about it, my public life versus my private life, is that most of my family, like my growing up, they all call me Daniel because that was how they knew me, and my father was Esau. But just because
Hmm.
I was scared, you know, they ask you your name at school and you just kind of shout out. They just use your first name and you're afraid to correct them. So it's been really interesting that most people who've known me since I've been an adult call me Esau when all of my family calls me Daniel. And so wrestling
Hmm.
with, because my father, as you'll find out in the book, my father leaves when we our children, we kind of left to our own devices. And so Esau is kind of seen as the bad name, and Daniel is seen as the good name. And so, being even as an adult, for everyone to know me by the name Esau has always been a little bit complicated for me for a variety of reasons. And so, when people ask me a lot, which I get, like I said, tell me the story of your name, I often say, well, you don't know me well enough to know the story of my name. And it sounds like it's arrogant, but it was just
Hmm.
like I couldn't process really quickly all of that stuff. And so in the
Yeah.
book, I finally feel like I make peace with the name, which seems like a strange thing for everyone to be. But like everyone seems like I'm who I am. But for me, that name and carrying that name was complicated. And I would tell you, it's interesting that you said that. I don't know if you said it during this recording before that you kind of saw the future of um, this book in Reading While Black. Here's something I would tell you that I think
Mm.
is a sneaky bit. So if you once you've read it, and you will understand how complicated my relationship with my father was. He leaves when we are young, and we don't have a relationship until the last few years of his life before he passes away. But Reading While Black is actually dedicated to my father. And so when people saw that
Mm.
dedication, it says this book is dedicated to the memory of Esau Daniel McCaulley Sr. Whatever else you made me, I am your son. And so everybody was saying, "Oh, this is so sweet. You must have had a great dad, and things are great."
Hmm.
But that was actually my way of beginning to process the influence he had on me, both like by his own absence. It was my way of saying, "Dad, I forgive you." And so, how far to the promised land, which is probably a weird thing to say, could be seen as a very long explanation of the dedication in Reading While Black, in the sense of how do the people who we love, who hurt us, shape the kind of people we become? And how do we make peace with that? It's something I think a lot of people
Yeah.
might struggle with. And so there was a sense
Mm.
in which I didn't know it at the time, but I began writing this book when I penned the dedication of Reading While Black after the book was finished, and I dedicated it to him.
I love that story, and I think it leads into one of my other questions, which again is kind of a through line throughout the book, that yes, this is a memoir, and it's a memoir about your family, and it's a memoir about being Black in America, but it's also a spiritual memoir. And all of those three elements, family and Blackness and your story, but also the spirituality, are somewhat embedded within the story of your name, right? And so
Yes.
I'm curious about the faith aspect of that. Like, could you just
Oh,
speak to not just growing up within the church, but like, what does it mean? I know there's a point in the book where you kind of surprise yourself by being asked who you are, and you say, I am a Christian. And just what did it take for you to get to the point of like claiming Christianity as identity, of Christianity becoming like a major orienting force in who
yeah.
you are?
Thank you so much, because you did a good you get a gold star, Amy, as someone who read the book
Oh,
well
look at that.
and understood what was going on. A lot of times people want they want you to summarize your story and say, "Tell me what this book is about in a soundbite." But our lives aren't sound bites. We're a bunch of things. And part of what it meant for me to grow up is to figure out what it meant to be black in America. But another part for me was to deal with the fact that my father left our family when I was young, and had a definitive impact on who I was. But those two, and we didn't have a lot of money, so we were poor. So I was black, I was abandoned by my
Mm,
father, and I was poor. But the question that I was asking in the midst of all of
yeah.
that is, where's God in this question? And so one of the things that I really respected is they allowed this book to be as Christian as I wanted to be, where that was relevant, and not Christian at all in other parts. And what I mean by that is not that God was absent.
Hmm.
It's just that, like, at every moment of my life, I wasn't processing things theologically. And a lot of times you just kind of
Hmm.
live, and you kind of live, and you kind of live. And of course, God is there through all of it, but you're not processing it through theological lens. But then you come to these places in your life when you say,
Yeah.
no, no, no. The last 5 to 7 years that have happened to me, where has God been? And so the freedom to tell an authentic story that weaves in all of them. And ultimately, and you can put it this way, if there's two characters who aren't on every page, but who are on every page, are both God and my Father. And their absence is a
Mm,
presence in places. And so the freedom to tell that kind of story, where a significant part of making sense of who I was figuring out the God question. And I know there's a lot of books that
Yeah.
talk about how you found your way to God. There's tons of books like that. And there's tons of books about being Black in America. There's tons of books about poverty. There's tons of books about dealing with like parental abandonment. But all of those things, they want something I wanted the freedom to tell. And I'm really proud. There's something that excites me about this book that makes me proud to have written it. It is,
Hmm.
I think that the spiritual part of the book that is crucial to to who I am comes through, and it's it's how, and maybe I want to put it this way. I didn't want to do something simple as how did I make it through? I made it through because of God. I mean, there's a way of saying it.
Right.
That's true, but what I want to say is that God was there in the midst of all of it. And he
Hmm.
was there even when I didn't recognize him as such. And so when I come to these points in the book where I talk about that, they may even feel like eruptions because there isn't like a slow build. It's just chapter, 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 God. And then chapter, 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 God. But that's how my life was, right? And if you know
Hmm.
me, if you hang out with me, you don't hear God every other sentence. I might be talking about the Lakers or LeBron James or whatever. And sometimes, I, the God bit comes out of me. And so to have an authentic book that allows the complexity of my life to come forward, that gives other people a reason to be complex. Because some people think, I'm either talking about God or I'm talking about race, or I'm talking about poverty, I'm talking about injustice, or I'm talking about spirituality. But we don't get to carve our lives up like that. We're a jumble of things. And hopefully my story gives people permission to be a jumble of things.
I think it does give that permission. And I want to ask you a question about one moment where maybe that will maybe bring this alive for listeners a little bit, because there's a scene where it's your junior year of high school and you blow out your knee in a football game. And so
Yeah.
you know that the prospect of playing Division I football in college and getting a scholarship for that like have just become slim, and it was pretty clear that that was going to happen. So I'm going to read, this is part of your prayer that night. You wrote that this is what you prayed to God. Surely you wouldn't leave me with a useless knee and broken dreams. You owe me. I can't end like this. And then you also write that your mother prayed a different prayer that night.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious now, you're an adult. You can look back on your story and see what
Yeah.
happened in some ways as a result of your knee not being what you wanted it to be.
Yes.
Um, how do you see those two different prayers now, and what do you think about them?
Yeah. So to put a little context, when I tore my knee up, that was my chance to go to college, I thought was through athletics. And so the prayer was for a miraculous moment
Yeah.
of healing. Because I'm from a tradition where we feel like God is a miracle worker. He can do whatever he wants. And so I'm thinking to myself,
Yeah.
if everyone sees me tear three ligaments in my knee, and then the next day I run, or the next week I run back out onto the field, look how God's going to get glorified by me being healed and returning to my former glory. So I prayed that prayer. And
Yep.
then I said, okay, God, I'm now going to walk. Like you take your mat, you like take up your mat and walk. And so I put the crutches to the side and try to put weight on my knee, and it collapses. And I'm just like, I can't believe God didn't answer my prayer. And
Yeah.
my mother is praying for a different thing. She never prays for my healing. She prays for a doctor because we
Mm.
don't have insurance. She prays for a doctor who can do the surgery for free because we couldn't afford to have the
Mm.
surgery. And God actually answers my mother's prayer, and God doesn't answer my prayer.
Mm.
And because there, a doctor kind of shows up miraculously, and I get free rehab and all of these other things. But what I learned is like sometimes the miracles don't take away the problems. The miracle is that God allows you to live
Mm.
another. The miracle is like manna in the wilderness to kind of keep you until you get to where God wants you to go. And I can say now in Providence, I can see God's wisdom. If I don't hurt my knee, then I don't go to the college that I go to. I don't meet my wife. I don't have the spiritual experiences that I had to make me to the person that I have. I never discovered that I'm a writer. And so there are tons of ways in which
Well, that
God used my injury to dramatically change the course of my life in such a way that I would be more useful to him and to become a better person. And so God used that tragedy to fulfill his purposes. And I couldn't see it at
Mm-hmm.
the time. And if you had told me um that this is going to be the outcome, then I would have said, "Sure, God, I will do it." But at the time, it felt like God had abandoned me. And the thing that I want to say is,
Mm.
the miracle is not that I returned to my former glory. I never became that athlete again. The miracle is that, like, the future that I had planned for myself wasn't the future that God wanted me to have. And God, in His mercy, used the tragedy. I'm not saying He caused it. Did He use the tragedy to make me into the person He wanted me to be?
Well, and that's something that comes up at that section in the book. And again, I think you do this in a really deft way in terms of exactly what you just said, not trying to look back and be like, oh, God, reached down and snapped the ligaments or something like that. But you do write that one of the things you recognized at that time was that you were more than a black body. You had a black mind. And it
Yeah,
seemed like that was really important because up until that point, you'd gotten good enough grades to be able to survive in school, from what I can tell, but you
yeah,
had not kind of turned on your intellect and I'm sure there were multiple factors going on there, but I'm curious about like why it was so important for you to know that you were more than a black body. And then also just at the same time, you also knew that you wanted to go to college and the way to get there was through sports. So there's a
yeah,
little bit of a tension there at the same time that so yeah, can you just talk about
yeah.
that a little bit?
So a lot of times people try to think about athletes as being people who are chasing this very unlikely dream of becoming a professional athlete. But a lot of people who I knew who
Yeah.
wanted to use sports to get to college, and because we knew other people who had used sports to get to college, that was a clear path. And at my school, for
Mhm.
example, nearly half the seniors on the football team, actually probably closer to three quarters, but people say I'm exaggerating. So I say half the seniors on the team who started got scholarships. So if you went to that school and you started on the
Mhm.
football team, you were
Yeah.
started for 2 years. At the end, you normally got a scholarship. So it was a pretty secure path to college.
Yeah.
And I knew people who had gone to college. So I said, okay, I can go to college. And since I was a reasonably good,
Yes.
the bar for a football player is pretty low. You have to kind of have a minimal GPA
Yeah.
and minimal grades, like a 2.5 or something, to get into college. So I said, okay, I know that I'm good enough to get a scholarship. I only have to get this grade. So it's all I ever tried for. Now, because I was a decent student, I actually was an above average academic athlete. So I could get recruited by
Mhm.
places like Vanderbilt, like kind of slight, like nerdy
Mhm.
football. But it was still a combination in my head of my athletic ability and my brain. I never thought, well, why don't I just cut out the middleman and put the football aside and just do better and go to Vandy? I was like, oh, if I do well here, I can even go and do like, or an Ivy League school. There's these ideas that basically I didn't have the grades to just apply to an Ivy League school. But for a football player, I did pretty
Mm.
well. Now, once football was gone, or I thought it was gone, I ended up playing in college. I I don't know why it just didn't click in my head until then. Well, now the only way for me to get there is through my intellectual ability.
Yeah.
And it was that moment of having sports taken away from me for a season that I really had to see what I could do intellectually. And I discovered, much to my surprise, that I was a better student than I knew. And
Mm.
and and for me, that idea that I was more than just a body, that who's willing to do,
Yeah.
to run into people and to throw people on the ground to get to get to college, that I could think my way to college, was something that was important to me. But I guess
Yeah, and
even
seems like
in that story, I want to say though, it's easy to dismiss this unless you live in a community where you don't see very many college educated people and you don't see the
Yeah.
path to get there, that it's really straightforward. You say, why don't you just do your work? Well, who did I know who was this college educated person living in my neighborhood? I was the first male from my family to graduate from college. My sister, who's 2 years older than me, was the first person to graduate from college. Not just amongst my siblings, like amongst my extended family. And so we didn't have a picture of it. But I
Yeah.
knew people who had gotten scholarships. And so for me, it was profoundly logical to put all of my hopes in sports.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting. On the one hand, it's like can be reductionistic, right? To only see yourself or have other people see you as valuable because of what your body can do on a field. On
Yeah.
the other hand, it's really expanding your possibilities to have a way to imagine going to college. And so there's a both and happening there. And I think we just want to create more and more conditions where the imagination is shaped by possibilities, whether that's intellectual and physical, one or the other, both and. But you want more and more of that for more and more kids who are in a situation where they might not have that in their family, but it still is actually possible.
I called it a gateway drug. And so I wasn't the only person
Right.
who
Yes.
used sports as a gateway drug into education. There's tons of people who stayed in school just to play football or basketball or baseball. And then because you gave them something to hope for. But in the process of staying in school, they found themselves. And so when we dismiss athletics, we don't, because of the long odds, we don't see it as a way to give
Mm-hmm.
people hope. So there's tons of people who didn't become few. Like there's two people from my school who went to the NFL, three maybe, I think three, in during the 15 years that I was around in Huntsville. And so,
Mm-hmm.
of course, 15 out of hundreds and hundreds of athletes is not very many. Sorry, three NFL players out of hundreds and hundreds of athletes
Yeah.
aren't very many. But how many of us stayed in school because our coach said you had to stay eligible? Then they got to their senior year and they said, "Oh, I might as well graduate." And then they say, "Oh, I might as well go to college." And so it was a way of keeping us invested until we found ourselves. And I just found myself in a much different
Yeah.
way than I expected. But I don't think I would have ever gone to college had I not been an athlete first, because it was athletics that had my imagination for such a long period of time.
Mm. I love that. Thank you for kind of spelling that out, like weaving those pieces together. I wanted to ask actually as a follow up about hope, because this is a book that has, instances of trauma and pervasive, both kind of casual and more systemic racism throughout it. Fatherlessness. You've already told us a bit about that experience with your dad, and yet I think this is also a profoundly hopeful book. And so you've spoken a little bit about what it means, for a high school student to have hope. But what gives you hope? Like what keeps you not in some sort of like false or toxic positivity stance,
Yeah.
but in a place where you can actually hold the real sorrow and loss while also remaining hopeful, in, I think, the goodness and love and purposes of God.
You win gold star number two because the only common word. So this is between Reading While Black title, Reading While Black African American Biblical Interpretation as an
Hmm,
exercise in hope, and the
that's
subtitle
right.
for
Yes.
How Far to the Promised Land is One Family's Search for Hope and Survival. And so I have been for most
Yep.
of my life obsessed with the idea of hope because for so long, I couldn't figure out what hope was there. The odds would seem to be so long. They say you're going to end up dead and in jail. That's
Yeah.
the kind of stuff they said about us in our neighborhood. You're the kids who aren't worth anything and you're not going to become anything. And, but for some reason, I've always had a sense of hope that my past didn't have to define what
Hmm.
I became. And I've tried to find ways to articulate why that's the case. And
Mm.
what I found, and there's another hope related book somewhere in the back of my head that I want to talk about right now. What I found is I
Mm.
think that hope and honesty are inextricably linked. So sometimes people find hope by shrinking the problem. It's not that bad, therefore I can have hope. But that to me is a false hope.
Hmm.
The only kind of hope that
Yeah.
God can provide for us is the solution to the problems that we actually have. And so until you face the darkness, you can't find the light. And so what makes me
Hmm.
willing to tell my story as plainly as I can is because it is precisely into that world that God speaks as a word of loving kindness and care. There is no other world for God to come to other than the world that does this to people. And so the hope that I provide, that God gives to me, is a hope in the face of real difficult circumstances. So, on one level, I can just say hope is just my confidence in the power of God. But another thing that I would say is hope is my belief in the power of God to be there with me through the midst of my actual problems, not the ones that I lessen to make it better for God to manage. We have this subtle idea, and I mentioned it in the prayer, that if you kind of hold back, you can ask God for big things, right? That you don't want to bother God
Hmm.
all the time. You're like, okay, God, I only need 2 or 3 big asks for my life. And this is where I need you to show up. And that's what it means to have hope. But no, like God is actually not just there during the big ask, but God is always with us through every part of our lives. And I've just concluded as a Christian that I believe the Christian story is true. And if the Christian story is actually
Hmm.
true, if Jesus died for our sins and 3 days later he rose from the grave, there is no problem bigger than the power of God. So we can always tell the truth. We can always tell the truth. And I think that one of the problems that the church
Hmm.
as a whole has is that we're terrified of the truth. We can say,
Hmm.
okay, if we're honest about all the ways which the church is complicit in racism and misogyny, then what kind of Christianity can be there on the other side? But if the Christian story is true, then we can be honest about the feelings of the church with the trust that God can solve those problems by his power and by his goodness. And so I'm always trying to help us to trust God enough to tell the truth and to trust on the other side of that truth telling is more goodness. That God doesn't exhaust his goodness in solving small problems. That God's goodness is
Hmm.
abundant. There's a passage you can met the New Testament scholar in me that he's a rich in mercy. God doesn't have a little bit of mercy, right? He doesn't have like, oh, I spent all my mercy
Hmm.
and grace last Tuesday. Mercy payday
Yeah.
isn't for another 2 weeks, then I get another credit. He has a ton of the stuff, right? And so my hope is simply, like I said, in the power of God. And I have not found another story or another person that has captured my imagination and inspired me, like the story of the birth, death, resurrection of Jesus as the climax of the biblical narrative and a point towards the future. That is my hope. And that's the basis by which I try my best to live my life. And I'm imperfect like any other Christian.
Hmm. Thank you so much for that. My most recent book was about healing, and one of the places I kind of landed in looking at biblical healing was that the movements towards healing are honesty, humility, and hope. That those three, not always in that order, but are kind of the like, I don't know if necessary preconditions is to say it too strongly, but that healing comes when we are honest about what is painful and hard and broken and all of those things, humble about our inability to fix the problem and that we have needs from God and from one another, but hopeful that that story is true, that those things can actually, that healing is possible, that change is possible, and that when you put honesty, humility, and hope together, healing does begin to happen. And I'd love to maybe end with one more story, and you can tell as much or as little of it as you want to. But I was really struck by, again, a hopefulness that I saw as a story of healing towards the end of the book when you tell the story of your wedding. And you write about this is a quote, the church doing its work. And I wondered if you would
Yeah.
be willing to talk about the ways you've seen the church do its work, perhaps sometimes in unexpected places and through unexpected people.
Yeah, it's funny. It's that's one of my favorite chapters. It's called Fools Fall in
Mm.
Love. And it's a story.
And I told you
I,
I wept while reading it. It was so good.
uh, it's like Amy. I'm just at some point. I was just being ridiculous in this book. And what I mean by that is there's a chapter on police violence, and then there's a love story right in the middle of it. Like in the book. Like I was like, okay, and
Oh,
then
but
here's a
that's
chapter.
also your life, right?
It's my life. It's my life, right? These are things that happen, and so I'm once again begging the audience's indulgence where I tell a love story in a chapter. Um, and it's called Fools Fall in Love. And it tells the story of how I met my wife. And what you have in mind is when we were getting married, um, we didn't have any money to pay for the wedding. And we the church kind of surrounded us during that moment. I was just a broke youth pastor. And she was in medical school. So she was just a student. And so it was this tiny white all New England all white New England church. And all of the ladies at the church, because we couldn't afford what do you call it, catering. And so all of the ladies at the church brought their old New England fine dining, fine china. And each one of the tables
Yeah.
in the church were decorated with the fine china from all of the families in the church. And the food that was there were the
Mm.
old church ladies who went and made a bunch of casseroles and all of the food and their best meals. And so the food from the church was actually the food that the congregation cooked. The wedding cake my mother had flown in for the wedding was the German chocolate cake that I used to eat as a child. And so my mother flew in the day before, made the German
Mm.
chocolate cake as the wedding cake. And even the flowers, we couldn't afford um, uh, the floral arrangements. And so it was in the Anglican church, it's the fourth Sunday of Advent. So there's like these red poinsettias that are often around. And then in New England, they had this thing called the greening of the church, where they kind of put extra greenery around to make the church beautiful for Christmas. And so they actually put the greenery on a few days earlier. Our wedding anniversary is a few days before Christmas. And so the church is decked
Mm.
out in like this beautiful red poinsettias from Advent, and it had like the greenery getting ready for Christmas. And then like it's like it's an evening wedding, so we walk from one part where the chapel is unto where the food is. It's like snowing in New England, and you go in, and it's just this candlelight dinner of all of this fine china. It looks amazing, but we're all broke. Like we didn't pay for any of it. And
Yeah.
it was to me and we're both Southerners, and like I'm this black
Mm.
guy, and this all white congregation really showed me and my wife the love of Christ. And it was one of the times where it was the first time since I had been in Huntsville, Alabama at the Black Baptist church that raised me that I felt like I was in a church that was an actual family. And that was in a totally different context. I remember when I first got there, they couldn't even understand me, and I didn't understand what they were talking about. I want to do a
Mm.
bad boss like, in the car and get some chowder. And I was like, "What's going on with your Southern accent?" We know what we was talking about. I never forget that this is a complete. This is a deep New England cut, but they had this place called Gloucester, and if you know how Gloucester is spelled, it's called Gloucester. And it's like, I'm like, where's Gloucester?
Indeed.
What are you talking about? I was like, no, it's Gloucester. And so it's just like there's this whole time where like we didn't know what to do with each other, but we became a church family there. And that moment to me has always struck me. I think everybody thinks their wedding is the best wedding, But I'm going to argue that if you read it, you will say that our wedding was the best wedding, and everybody else, y'all just got to feel bad and wonder why your church didn't do y'all like we were done.
I love that story so much, and I really did like cry when I read it because I am in one of those, essentially all white New England churches with lots of little old church ladies, and who can seem kind of like they're not up to date when it comes to politics, and trying to have conversations about racial justice might not go very far, and yet there is a sincere love for Jesus and for people, and a willingness to like really go all out in order to honor people well. And I just love that picture of your mom there with her German chocolate cake, and the
Yeah,
little church ladies with their china, and that sense of really being received, and celebrated,
yeah.
for who you are, and for who your family would become, because you and Mandy have gone on to have
I
four
was
kids,
nervous.
and I'm sure that those ladies are happy about it.
Yeah, I was nervous about that chapter because once again, you don't expect a love story to break out in a book like this. You want it to be all sad and somber, and you getting there.
Mm.
And if people read that chapter, they will see that the story is more complex than I told here. But giving yourself space to talk about, once again, something that's important to you. And what was important to me is the fact that I fell in love, and that I'm married, and that I became a father. And I then had the opportunity to chart a different course for my family and my children. And that is an important part. And I understand that people can be healthy and happy and whole apart from being married. I'm not talking about like marriage is the completion of one's life vocation. I'm not saying any of that at all. God bless you if you're single. God bless you if you're married. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that in my narrative, the that my relationship with my wife is an important part of the story, and getting space to tell that kind of complicated story is once again a part of what it means to be human, right? Who do we spend our time with, and how do we make sense of the sacrifice that comes with meeting someone who is different from you, who has their own hopes and dreams, and how that collision of two different hopes and dreams and ideas of the future, out of that collision comes something like what we might call a life and a marriage. And so, yeah, I really like Fools Fall in Love. I'm glad that you liked it. I'm glad that you
Oh
liked
my
that
gosh, I
chapter.
loved it. I literally I took pictures of some of the pages and sent them to my husband, just as a like, this is what marriage is all about. I loved it. But I also think what you just said, speaks to, and we don't have time to get into this, but I'm just going to leave it as like a teaser for listeners. But you also do a great job of insisting that the story of being Black in America is not only a story of travail, right? It is also a story of joy.
Yeah.
And that's really important. And I think that's something you've done well, not only in this book and in telling the celebratory moments, but also in the New York Times when you've written there. And I go to a camp in the summer with my family. Our oldest daughter has Down syndrome. And so it's a camp for families affected by disability. And on the last night of camp, they host something that they call a Luke 14 banquet, based on the parable in Luke 14, when all the people who are not expected to be invited to the wedding banquet are invited, and they come in and sit down together. And one of the things that happens at that banquet is that they serve dessert first. And the hosts of the camp, who have, in one case, Catherine had a stroke and has a disability. And she says, yeah, we're eating dessert first because we want it to be clear, in the midst of a life that for many people here is filled with suffering and hardship, do not wait to celebrate. We're going to celebrate right now for the life you have right now. And we're not denying the suffering in it, but we are also going to celebrate together. And I think that story of your wedding is, and just speaking and writing about Black joy, all of those things weave together into this, what you were talking about when it comes to hope, that it's very honest. And yet it also insists and continues to insist on the goodness of God, and on a story that has not been finished yet, that we are all a part of. So I just want to thank you for giving us your time today, for giving us your words in this book. And yes, if any listener has not already stopped this podcast and gone out and bought your book, I'm going to tell them they should do that right now. because I got an early reader copy, and the only reason I was annoyed about that is that I couldn't buy it for friends and hand it out left
Oh,
and right. But I'll do that when it actually comes out.
thank you. It comes out, I think, in September
Yeah.
12th.
So we'll air this
Sorry.
podcast closer to when it's coming out. So it'll be available either very soon after this podcast airs, or it'll already be available because we're gonna hold
Oh,
it till
thank you.
September.
Well, I want to say you are a good interviewer because you took the time to read and to think about the book, and you helped me understand some of the things that I was doing. I didn't even notice a thing about my name and how it carries a bunch of the different themes in the book until you said, I was like, oh, that's actually correct. All of these things are tied together. So thank you for being a careful and generous reader. And stories are complicated. And
Mm-hmm.
the vulnerability of our stories are complicated. And you share a little bit of yourself in the hope that it helps other people find themselves. And so if I manage to succeed in doing that and in the course of finding themselves, hopefully find themselves a little bit closer to God. If I manage to succeed in doing that,
Mm.
then it was worth the effort. And so thank you for reading it.